The standing committee is in some ways almost like the vestry or the bishop's committee in the congregation. The standing committee, if the bishop is unable to function, say, I mean, they're just deathly ill or something's happened, or they have to go out of town, or they're on a sabbatical or something like that, they stand in and are the ecclesiastical, meaning the church authority. And they are the body that also makes any of the bigger major decisions about, including things even about property. Like, for instance, and this ties into the parish thing here, is if we said, you know what, we just want to sell the Champ House and everything, and everybody would go like, okay, well, let's just do it.
Wait, what?
We're selling it. Actually, we got 2 buyers. So you buddies are out. No, I'm joking. No. I say, if. So, say if that was to happen. But we love Clay and all those people so much. We would. So what you would have to do is say that the parish came to a decision they'd like to do that. You have to submit that to the standing committee of a diocese and say, do we have permission to do this? Because in our understanding, and this kind of gets into when somebody, you may remember when there were some of the churches, when we finally kind of made decisions about including women, including LGBT and all these things, some people said, well, we're out of here and we're taking the church with us. And we said, no, if you don't want to be a part, you can always go somewhere if you would like. I mean, we're sad to see you do that, but if that's what you want to do, you can. But you can't confiscate something that you don't belong to you. The church, everything that is here, it is our congregation, and we do make most of the decisions, but we can't just say, you know what, we're going to join the Baptist church now, so we're taking everything with us. We would be welcome to go down the street to the Baptist church, but this belongs to the property of the Episcopal Church of the United States of America. So, and all of our, every congregation has bylaws, and in there, it should be right up front that says, we accede to and accept all the canons and constitutions of the Episcopal Church, et cetera, saying, this is very clear, this is who we are. Because, I mean, in a sense, that like 150, can you imagine getting 150 years and throwing it out the window? And like, you know, what if you have a memorial garden or something like that, and all of a sudden you want to come and see your relatives and it's no longer the Episcopal Church. It's just kind of, you know, so that's kind of, standing committee is very active in that. The standing committee kind of works also with the bishop, and they usually try to come to consensus, but occasionally you'll see a standing committee and a bishop saying, well, we don't feel the direction of the diocese on this, maybe that's the best. But that's usually, I mean, it's not uncommon, people just work together. There's one other body called Diocesan Council, and they are the ones that work really on the regular day-to-day things in the church. So each church has a representative from it to the Diocesan Council, usually. Or there is, here, because there would be so many, on the council, your region, so we're like the North region, and there's about 3 or 4 congregations in our North region. Somebody is elected from one of those congregations to represent our area. And then they come and, like, for instance, they are the ones who determine, like, look at the budget and say, okay, well, here's the diocesan budget and so forth. What do we do with it? And say, how do we discern the appropriation of how this should best be used? Now, a lot of work has been done. I'm on the Diocesan Finance Committee. I wonder the wisdom of their thought in doing that. We've already pretty much done most of the putting together with the diocesan financial officer and treasurer. Is mostly put together, but that's done in consultation. And then it keeps going up steps. And then it finally comes to the council about how it should be administered. But the actual budget itself is approved at diocesan convention by everybody. But they kind of say, how is this then administered out? They also are about like mission and visioning and doing a lot of things like that about what should we as a diocese try to focus on and offer that as a council advice to the bishop. So there you go. In the congregation, you will have, if the priest who is present, there can be 3 titles for the priest. No matter what, anybody who's at any congregation say, oh, I'm the priest at St. John's, I'm the priest at St. Swithin's in the swamp, or, or wherever it may be, I had a friend of mine who was actually was the priest at St. Mary the Virgin in New York City, which is known as Smoky Mary's. And it's literally, you don't even have to have a service for them to have incense. Cody, you would love that. I mean, when they have a solemn Eucharist, there's at least 2 thuribles going the whole time. But I mean, it's like it's right in the middle of Times Square. It's the neighborhood parish for Times Square. It's actually started in the late 1800s as a reach out to the neighborhood of the church to revitalize worship and all this stuff. And the people of that time, the worship that appealed to them was the more kind of very high church, and they loved it because most worship was so mundane and boring that they said having all this richness in here was wonderful, because at that time that neighborhood was mostly working class, and they never got to experience anything elaborate or nice or fancy like a lot of wealthy did in their daily lives. So when they came to church, they retreated to this celebration, so they loved it. And it's been a very active congregation for many years. So you have, so the priest will have 3 titles, possible 3. The rector, the vicar, or the new one, this is a newer term that is now one, priest in charge. The rector is the priest of a congregation that will receive not even just one. If you receive 1 penny from the diocese, you can't be the rector. I'll explain that in a second. So you have the rector is at a congregation that is 100% self-supporting and makes all of its own budget, money, income, everything. Okay, and then so the priest is the rector. Rector means rule or guide. Kind of comes from old. A lot of these have old English meanings. Okay, and then you have the vestry. The vestry is the church board. Okay, vestry. In fact, if you go to Britain, you'll see a lot of these buildings. A lot of them are round, especially if they're next to a cathedral, and it's called the vestry, the same name as the group. And that's usually where, back in the 1600s and stuff, the people who met to make decisions for the cathedral and stuff, that's where they gathered in the room with the clergy. So they just called it the vestry. And so they became the vestry. So that's how that title, okay? If the congregation receives, like I said, doesn't matter if it's $500 or $80,000 from the diocese, like the Diocese of Utah, then the priest is the vicar. Vicar means to stand in place of. And what it means is you're standing in place of the bishop, because the bishop is technically the rector. And the priest does everything in the bishop's stead. But let me tell you, when it comes down to regular life, the difference between a vicar and a rector is 0. I mean, the bishop doesn't want to have to deal with the daily administration of the congregation and all that. They have all this other stuff. They have every congregation to think about. So these are just terminologies, but there are some differences. Technically, if the bishop wanted to, Bishop Phyllis could come to me and say, Jason, you're gone. Bye. A rector, you cannot. But that 99.9% chance never happens. That would be very rare. It would be because of something that, is really bad. It's not just because you don't agree about something,
And you have no recourse.
Well, you can, if you feel that it's unjust, you can file, charges and stuff. Yeah, you can do that.
In our history,
What's that?
that the bishop said to the vicar, "Time to go,"
It did happen once, yeah, from what I understand.
and there was a good reason for it.
Yeah. Yeah,
So what are you?
I'm a vicar.
A vicar.
Yeah,
So
so,
that means part of your pay comes from the diocese, whereas if you're a rector, all the pay comes from the local
Yeah.
division, and that's the main division
Yeah.
in reality.
this congregation technically, if we really were okay, let me put, I'm not saying we should, but if we really wanted to live lean,
Yeah.
and we did all of our own bathroom cleaning, we did, I mean, everything. Now, and I've been in a church where we did that, you know, but they were used to that. That's what they, they didn't have options. That's what you did, you know, and we were able to become self-sufficient much earlier. This congregation was self-sufficient. Then, now, let me explain why right now only 3 or 4 churches in this entire diocese are parish status, not mission status. That used to not be so. What happened, and there's always, you know, sometimes there's always wonderful good things that happen, but sometimes they have bad side effects or things down the road. The Diocese of Utah owns St. Mark's Hospital in Salt Lake City. It's always been the Episcopal Hospital. Well, when they sold that, you can guess how many millions of dollars
Yeah.
that was made on that. Well, the bishop at the time then used millions of dollars. Part of this building we're in is because of that. We didn't just all of a sudden come up and say, here's $10 million to build, or 4 or whatever it was, to build this, the big addition and everything. That was money that was then seeded in congregations to help stimulate, which is good. But what is usually needed with that is a plan about to go with the building, not just do a building and like they will come. That's sometimes our problem. As Episcopalians, we just like, oh, build it, they'll come. No, this is not the 40s or 50s anymore. So they built the building and everything, and then they started just giving congregations a lot of money to help. And I mean, yes, and money does help. And like, but if you've got a plan, it really helps. Because then you can say, well, we're taking this to hopefully reach out, let people know we're here. You're using that for mission, for evangelism, to reach out. Well, a lot of places just didn't know what to do with it. And so a lot of the congregations became kind of said, well, we really don't have to raise that much money. You know, if everybody doesn't pledge, or whether it's $100 a year or $10,000 a year, whatever it is, if they don't make a commitment, well, the diocese will cover that. Well, what happened is you had, from the majority of the places all being self-sufficient, to only 3 or 4. Because they got really used to it. Okay? So money is good, it's just, it wasn't, and all of a sudden, 8-10 years later, people are going like, oh, what happened? And they were like going, oh wow, we really did get kind of used to that. So it's not a bad thing, and in some places it's really done and helped, and I think without what we have today, it would be hard to do some of the things we're seeing now. Okay, so it really is good, it's just taken a while. So that was part of our problem. And what happened also is, as I've understood, and I've only really that during the 70s, the whole congregation was like 10 or 12 people.
Wow.
That's it, total. And were you here? Yeah. And so you remember that, and I think that was after you came though, wasn't it?
No, it was, I didn't come till 2000s.
Okay, all right. So you kind of remember these, and yesterday, the funeral we had for Virginia, one of the things that was highlighted is she was, and this is what happens when you get a small, and what you call that is kind of a family style congregation. You get family people in there who sustain and make sure the church exists. Virginia was one of these ones who said, you know, good times, bad times, lean, I'm here, St. John's matters, and I'm sticking with it. And, you know, did it all together, you know, and everybody wears 10 hats, you know. So, and I mean, that's still true in the church, no matter how big you get, because then more things happen, you need more people to wear hats. So she was really kind of doing that. And so we really honored one of the things we wanted to honor. And I think she would probably be excited to see, knowing that the congregation really, life is coming over years. It's been coming and coming. So the congregation was there, and we got that. So there was basically no money. So when the diocese stepped in, and the congregation was starting to pick up a little bit, and then that money came in, that infused, it helped a lot. and then it got a little bigger, but never quite to break that barrier, okay? Although I think it's important, but it's not so important to say, well, I want to just know and say I am a parish and I'm the rector, and that's good. That's a good goal, but don't do it to spite yourself because you got an ego or you feel that, well, I just want to say that. I want to be proud of what we've done. What you do is, I've been a vicar, I've been a rector, and I've been a priest in charge. And I've probably been some other names. But I've held all three of those titles. And in the end, the thing is like right now, vicar is fine. And I do think we can be completely self-sufficient. I do. But right now, if we forced ourselves, we could do it. But I think it would be too hard, too much of a shock right now. I think what we do is we plan and work, and that's part of one of the reasons the Finance Committee was started, so they can give guidance to us about how can we best be stewards of what we already have and how we move ahead. Because one of the things we're blessed with is we've been left some endowments where people, when they passed, they left the church in their will and said, here's some money that I want you to invest into the life, which that's a wonderful thing, and we should be encouraging people to do that. And what it's done is it really helps. It helps seed those future ministries. So we actually have money in the bank. But part of it is earmarked for specific things. Or it's in an area where we need it because, like a building fund, what happens if the air conditioners go out or the heat? Where are you going to get all that money all of a sudden? So thank God we have that. But if we got rid of that all just to pay for the regular budget right now, it could leave us in a tight place. So what we know is I think each year it is good that I think that our diocesan, what we get as a grant is reduced. Now, we're very fortunate. Last year, this year, and next year, they're not going to reduce it. Because they know one of the things, and I had to write and we have to put together a thing each year about here's why we think we would like to have this grant from the diocese. And one of the things is we say things are happening, and right now to take money away when there's growth and life happening would be something to like pull the rug out from under you. Don't do it now. Yes, in the future. So I think like towards moving towards parish status is something we plan and work on and do it gradually and then celebrate when we get there. But don't, spite your face, because, you want a particular title. So,
Do you know what your parish is in Utah?
well, the cathedral,
Yeah.
they're all in the Salt Lake area.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's St. Paul's and All Saints and the cathedral, and there may be one other.
St. James.
Maybe St. James. But I know St. Paul's and All Saints and the cathedral. Now technically, like there's some congregations who say, well, I'm going to have, they're smaller, but they can meet the basics and they don't require a lot of extra funding. There's one is that something Spirit in the Desert or something. They are technically self-sufficient, but then you have to do it for 2 to 3 years in a row, and then you can be listed as a parish. And so they're doing it in a creative way. It's different, but it's smart. Yeah. So so if you are self-sufficient, the church is a parish, but that's still a generic term. Don't worry about this. Technically, in the name at the diocese, we are considered a mission congregation. Same thing, exactly the same. And then I'm a vicar. Well, when that kind of grows and changes, we'll be listed as a parish in the diocese, and I'll be the rector, or whoever's here. Okay, so that's kind of how that works a little bit. Sorry, I know that took a little long, but that's kind of a little bit of it's interesting and somewhat unique to our diocese in the sense of why in most dioceses, you always have parish and missions, and some congregations become parishes, then missions, and parish again, mission. It just happens, There's no good or
Can you explain the
bad.
term priest in charge?
Oh, yes. Priest in charge happens. Like, this happened when I came to San Diego. The bishop brought me in as a priest in charge. that means you're not the vicar or you're not the rector. So when you're elected and when the bishop approves and the vestry approves and you're made rector, we basically have tenure. Unless you do something stupid and you're messing up, I could technically stay as long as I want. But if you have any common sense, you kind of know when it's time to, whether it's good or bad. You know, when I left Church of the Transfiguration in Lake St. Louis, I was there for 18 years. I knew I had done everything that I could do, and they needed someone with a different set of gifts to take them to their next step. Because I brought them through 3 phases of panic, because they had 16 people when I got there. Then through the time of development and growth, and then to the time of stability. And when I left, they had, the membership was around 250. And we had become the first mission to gain parish status in over 68 years in Missouri. And they're doing great. She's been, in fact, the new rector, she's been there since I left in 2014, doing great. So it's fine. So when I came to San Diego, the church there had been, St. David's had been through upheavals and things where they'd start to get going and then went down, and there was internal strife. Much of, I will admit, was hidden from me by the bishop. Big no-no.
You walked into it.
I knew that I knew some of it, and I'm like, okay, because, you know, that's the thing, and I have done church development, church growth things, and I said, okay, well, these things, you address these things so you get past them, and then you can move on to that and get past those things that keep stalling you. Well, I didn't know the extent of how bad and nasty some of these people were. And so he said, okay, you come, and if this, especially like after a year, if this seems like this is finally going to work, before we do rector and all of that, and everybody's stuck for good or bad, you know, but the congregation is enough financially self-supportive, but I don't want them to give them a rector yet, because I want them, so they can't be a vicar because they're self-supporting, but they don't really need a rector yet because we don't know. So I got there, and I was there for almost 4 years as the priest in charge, and the bishop kept holding off and would never make a decision. And while I was there, we paid off our mortgage, we did all of these things there, the parish grew, but we had 3 times where it would start to grow, and 1 to 5 people would work together to sabotage everything we had just done. And the congregation, there'd been such a pattern of behavior of family system so long that everybody just completely were terrified of these people and would not challenge them or stand up to them to say, no, that's not what we do. And so they just gave them permission to enable dysfunction instead of to enable healthy behaviors. And so I kept trying to do what the bishop said I was there to do, to address that clearly, not in a mean way, but say, this is not acceptable, and this is what's going to take to move on. Well, they were like going, we've gotten rid of quite a few priests, and you ain't going to be one changing us.
You were the one she wrote in on.
Yeah, and it became a literally miserable hell on earth. So
My driver is here, so I need to.
Oh, no. And so what I eventually, and then the bishop just became, this is also when you get dysfunction sometimes with bishops, it happens, and priests, the bishop really kind of became this angry person. And I mean, he used to call, and he was an equal opportunity offender, it wasn't me. He'd call me and others in and just yell at us. And, you know, and say things like, if you were on my personal staff, I'd take you out in the hallway here and I'd fire you in front of everybody. You know, and stuff like that. You're incompetent. I can't believe I ever trusted you. You know, I was like, wow, you know. And word kind of got out that some clergy and some lady were considering bringing abusive charges against him. And I think he saw the writing on the wall, so he resigned. Thank God. And he made his promise. He said, I'll make sure you never become rector. It's a threat thing. And he did. And I just, finally it became so unhealthy. And it was the only time in my life I actually thought about after 27 years, I said, I just may leave the church. I just may leave ministry. I won't leave the church, but I just don't want to do this anymore. You know, I'm feeling physically ill, and spiritually it's taken a toll. So so that a priest in charge comes in where strategically the bishop and the leadership are saying, here's a congregation. We don't want to go, you're not the vicar, but I'm not sure they're ready to make a call yet, but I think you might be. This is what it's supposed to be done. The Bishop of Los Angeles did this a lot. I know this congregation well. And instead of bringing in 40 people to interview and blah, 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 and go forever and ever, and they're really ready to move on faster than a 2-year interim period, he says, I'm going to find a priest that I think is a good match. And the bishop takes a more active role in this and then goes to the congregation and he says, here's 1 or 2. How about they come as the priest in charge, and after 6 months or a year, like 1 year, if it's good, he or she, you're then the rector. So that's what it is.
Oh, thanks.
So that's a little difference.
Yeah, great.
So, okay. And then on the parish, again, in your congregation, so I've told you the 2 type of thing, that, vicar or rector, and then the church board is vestry or bishop's committee. And so we have a bishop's committee. Because since the bishop is technically, it's all just really verbiage and language at this point. But they function there are some differences, but not many, not worth noting. That's kind of the difference. Now, in how we make decisions, of course, as a congregation, is basically between mainly the bishop's committee and the priest working together. And what I've tried to move on and hopefully instill here is that the bishop's committee isn't something that comes in to meet and I say, here's what everything, blah, 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 this is what we should do and how we do, and just say, okay, all right, well, we came here, let's just vote on it, boom, okay, it's done, yes or no. That we work hopefully equally in that partnership of that they will hear my voice and I can hear their voice, and we hopefully work towards consensus, but also that they are, as leaders in the congregation, not just to come and vote on things, but they are to be spiritual leaders. And in that sense of, to hopefully live that, okay, I'm a member of the bishop's committee and I'm going to be really keenly aware that I want to be an example to the congregation. And part of that means I like them to also be a counsel of advice. So I can go to Bonnie Jean and I say, Bonnie Jean, I have no idea what to do about this. Please help me. and do that with the rest of the committee. So if those type of things happen. But they make decisions on the buildings, the grounds, the upkeep and all of that. But it should be, and where I could technically say, the priest literally in the canons can say, our Sunday worship is going to be at 10 p.m. on Sundays or 4 a.m. and that's the service. If you don't like it, don't come. That would be really stupid, So one of the things, like if you're thinking about making changes or stuff like this, is you should, if you hopefully feel confident, as the priest come to the bishop's committee or the vestry and say, here's what I'm looking at. I'd like your input and advice. And so like I've done that with talking about the Christmas services this year, since we have Christmas Day is actually on a Sunday, and there was some of that nuancing, so I asked about that. So that's how really at the parish, the congregation, the governance kind of works. And the only last element of that is every year we have an annual meeting, either in late January or early February, and what that is the congregational meeting. And in that one, you get a booklet where you have reports from various ministries, so you can see what's kind of been happening in the life of the congregation. And then some people can give a verbal report if they choose. And then you have the budget, which has been prepared and voted on by the bishop's committee, is presented to the congregation. And they say, here's the budget. The treasurer is supposed to present it. And then say, does people have questions about this? The congregation does not vote on the budget. The bishop's committee votes on the budget. But it is all laid out to the congregation. Our financial statements, our budget, our monthly statements, that is made public to everyone. There are no like secret little reports. None. None. So that's available to the whole congregation. We post them out even on the bulletin board out here. The minutes as well as financial decisions. So it's all very transparent. Okay. So that comes to the annual meeting and that's presented to them. And then you have each year someone that needs to be elected to the Bishops' Committee. And sometimes who's going to be your diocesan convention representative, who's going to be the delegate to go and vote on behalf of St. John's at the diocesan convention each year. So you'd all do electing, you receive and have the budget presented to you, and all of these other things. So you kind of talk about year end and year going forward. Okay. There's some churches that sometimes get in this thing of like wanting to have these things that go on for 3 or 4 hours, and it's just like, oh, that's why nobody wants to come. But they shouldn't be. They should not be that long. It should be actually an enjoyable gathering where we get things presented. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. That's kind of really about decision making and so forth. Someone did ask, I don't know if anyone wants to hear about kind of how you make a decision to call a priest.
Go for it.
Okay, just kind of briefly, when a priest leaves, the bishop and his offices should then come to the congregation to help you in the process of saying interim, meaning before, when you're in between a called priest, comes in and says to try to help then in giving you either an interim priest or supply to at least be there during that time. And then they are supposed to work with the Bishops' Committee and the congregation in general to make a profile of saying, who are you really and who are you really? And put together a written profile. Here, this is what St. John's is, who we are. And then they help you establish a search committee. And then what they do is, and they should then be trained about what they do. So what happens is in the national churches, the Office of Transitional Ministry nationally. And so what happens is when St. John's is ready, the bishop then says, okay, it can be announced that it's open. And they put that on there. And this goes out nationally and publicly and saying, here's congregations that are all in search process, either for a vicar, rector, priest in charge, whatever, bishop, whatever it may be, deacon, or Christian education director, whatever it may be. So that goes out there. And then clergy have access to see this, and laity for lay positions. And then, like with the one with St. John's, I saw it on there, then the priest, if they're interested, contacts the diocesan office directly and say, are you still receiving names? And would you be willing to consider me sending my materials to you? And then they almost always usually say, well, yes, we're still receiving them. Go ahead and send them and we'll look over them. The bishop and his staff look over them and decide whether they're willing to let the congregation consider these to see if there's anything initially you just kind of go like, but they look at that. Usually there's a quick call to your bishop and say, okay, is he or she a nutcase? Or whatever, do they really try to cause trouble or whatever, And if there's no major red flags, then like, oh, okay. So then it is then given to the search committee of the congregation as one of the candidates to consider. And then what usually happens if they decide they want to talk to this person, they then, the way it happens now is usually you're contacted in either by Zoom or I forgot what the other ones we used to use. But something like this, you would do interviews online, kind of just talking and things like this and questions and so forth. And for like on this one here, I had 2 of those different times. And then if they really want to consider you as a kind of a finalist of 2 or 3, then they say, okay, we're inviting you to come. And you do not meet with the congregation because for some real obvious reasons, if every one of them comes in and you do like a dog and pony show and people kind of start to think what their favorites are, but they don't really have all the information, it can really complicate the mess. So what you do, it protects both the clergy and the congregation from like, kind of like, oh, who's your little favorite? at least at first. So what you do is you get then, but the search committee is going on what the congregation has said they want. Because that's when they put that profile, they go to the congregation and say, what are the things that's most important for you're looking in a priest, and this and this, and for the congregation and so forth. So, hopefully it's not already like a major mismatch. So when I came, it's usually a pretty intense. You get here, they kind of show you around. Here's Logan. Here's Aggie ice cream. Things like this. And then you meet with the search committee one-on-one, so you have that personal thing, and you kind of get down to more like really, okay, we've already talked. Let's see where we really are. And then I had a social gathering with the bishops committee and the search committee, both. So they got to meet me and see me interact. In fact, you all were there. Yeah, it was at Frank's house. And then after that, the next morning when I was heading back to the airport, I went and had a meeting with the Bishop Hayashi, and that's a usually big kind of intensive talk. He was really intense. It was because he said at the very end, he said, here's what I'm really feeling. I'm just letting you know. So that's kind of how that kind of works. And then usually they hold their cards a little closer to the chest, but he's not that one that kind of does that too much. So then it's left to the search committee to say, okay, we've had these finalists. We needed to really discern of who do we recommend. So once they work through that, they go to meet with the bishops committee and say, here's those final candidates. Here's the one we recommend. What questions do you have? What do you want to know as those who make the decision? Is there something we need to help with? And then, and in this case, when my name went forward, then the bishops committee then has to vote on whether to accept that recommendation and to issue a call. Then they contact the bishop and say, we've agreed to this, and then the bishop says, I agree to it as well. And then he says, you may call the candidate and invite them to come as your next vicar. And so they will call, and I got a call from Ben and made that. And then it can't be officially announced, though, until a letter of agreement has been signed. And so, like, my announcement got delayed for a few days because the diocese was kind of slow in getting that together. And then they put it together, and I said, actually, that's not right. You missed this. And it's a good thing I've been ordained a while, because I'm looking like, no. I don't know where they got that. That's not right. So we had to correct it, and then you get it done, and then it can be publicly made.
Were you very happy?
Oh, yeah. Still am.
Good.
Kinda, I don't know.
That's a loaded question.
Okay.
It's been a whole
Well,
year.
yeah.
Quick
So-
question regarding
yes.
associate pastor, and
Oh, that's a good
when
question.
I left Virginia, it was very on the heels of our getting out of the state. I was getting these emails from Redeemer, and basically, nuts and bolts, it turned into a dumpster fire there. The rector, it was Title IX or Title whatever.
Not
and
good.
then out anyway, out the door and out the church and out the everything. And like I say, and I was horrified, shocked, and appalled. And I don't know how I would have felt other than twice that if I was still there. But they have had an associate pastor, a rector, through all of this.
Right.
And she's just been hanging in there. And then they've had supply, and they've had all kinds of other people standing in. And then they've just kind of left her out there, and I thought, I really feel like she's twisting in the wind. What's the process if they have an associate? I mean, she would have already
that's a
been
good question.
familiar with the church and everything.
Yeah. What happens is, when you call an associate at a congregation, the associate, the rector or vicar is always the one who's in charge, and the associate answers directly to them. And what they do is because you pastorally maybe need an extra clergy on hand, especially if the congregation gets larger and larger and larger. So the associate, and some places use associate, some use assistant. So they could say if you say associate rector, it's kind of confusing because that means they have authority and decisions, but they really don't. So, but they'll just maybe say associate priest or something like that. So, if then the person who's the rector or vicar leaves, the general rule is the associate cannot become then the rector or the vicar.
Oh, okay.
Now, they understand that going in, and I would understand that. That's usually the case. Sometimes there is an exception when it just seems so clear that this would really, really, really work and not confuse things. Okay? Now, a lot of times, though, during the interim period, they're not, there's no usually talk about whether they could be considered or something like this. It's like, well, they're associate and they're doing that, and usually then the bishop calls them and they have a talk and say, here's what we can consider or not consider. But it's going to be left up to the bishop whether that associate could be considered or not considered. And you will see both. And if they're not considered, then when the new rector comes on, the new rector will meet with the associate and they kind of decide if they think that the working relationship would still be good or if that person should start looking for another position. And of course, if they're then considered for the rector and they become it, then, there it is.
Yeah, and it's gonna be a long time before they get a lot of those hard feelings sorted out there.
Yes. And what she mentioned, when she mentioned Title IX, this is one of these things that's very just unfortunate when it happens, is occasionally fortunately for us in the Episcopal Church, it's very rare. But nonetheless, it happens. When someone finds out that a priest maybe, whether it's something of moral character or maybe they're having an affair with someone in the congregation, or
behavior of becoming a rector. in this case.
something that you have done that is obviously just like, no, leaders don't do this, then we're also, one of the things is if that's known in the Episcopal Church, we don't try to go like, and just not deal with it. It's dealt with, and it's dealt with publicly. And there's always room for reconciliation if possible. But in most instances, when the trust has been betrayed to a far extent like that, and it's usually something major, then the bishop feels that the person can no longer serve in that capacity there. And so there can be, like what they say, Title IX in the canons, that you've done something that's wrong, and therefore the bishop brings the charges are brought before you, and then you're usually what they put you, they inhibit you from functioning. So you're still a priest, but you can't function as one until investigations have been done, and investigations, and then a decision by a church tribunal kind of court say, we really believe this seems to be accurate, or no, maybe this is just someone being nasty or something, and they do that carefully and deliberately. And then if, there's found that this is not true, then everything can be kind of restored. But if it is true, then a lot of cases in places where it's really bad is quite often the bishop will defrock the person, and so that they are no longer ordained and no longer a priest, and they're removed from ministry. But again, thank God that's very rare, but it has happened. And people are people. Things happen, and they make some horrible mistakes.
Real quick, on the gospel side and the epistle side.
Yeah.
I'm just
You were
curious.
asking about when some people ask, and you hear this sometimes. And this is really getting into what I was supposed to talk about. You know me, but when you're facing the church, okay, and you're facing the altar. In many of our churches, and this church did until we kind of did the remodel, and so it's what we're doing is more a form of function, of real functionality. But as you face the altar, in a lot of churches, as you look to the right, there will be a lectern. And our old lectern is out in the narthex, the entry area, the one that's the shape of an eagle. That was the lectern where you would then read all scripture lessons. right side, facing the altar. And if you're facing the altar, on the left side would be the pulpit. And that's where the gospel is proclaimed. So this is called the epistle side, and this is called the gospel side. And why some people ask is if they're acolytes and stuff, some people say when you're lighting candles and stuff, they'll say, well, do I start with the epistle side or gospel side? And it's kind of gotten to where some say it doesn't matter as long as they get lit. But the old traditional way is you always start with the epistle, and then the gospel is lit last, because the gospel never stands alone. And so that's a traditional way of kind of looking at that. But as you notice now, as in a lot of churches, though this is case is true today, where the pulpit and the lectern are one. And that's perfectly fine. You know, some cases, if you still have it, you know, do the different things. That's kind of nice. But if you don't, it works fine too. So you don't have to have it, but that's kind of a traditional thing. I think we've exhausted our time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, yeah.
And that led us into this, and next week we're going to go really just right away into things about gestures and things that we kind of talked